The letter was dated 3 days after Veterans Day. I want you to hold on to that detail because I held on to it for a long time, not out of bitterness exactly, but because the timing told me something important about the kind of person who had written it. Not the HOA board in some general organizational sense, but the specific individual who had looked at the calendar, understood what week it was and what that week meant, and decided that this particular Tuesday in November was the right moment to tell a 22-year Army veteran that the flag he'd hung from the porch bracket on the house he'd earned through 2 decades of service was a violation of community aesthetic standards. I read it before Damon got home that evening, which was fortunate in retrospect, because it gave me time to decide how I wanted to present it rather than just handing it to him at the door. I sat with it at the kitchen table for a while, reading the language of Policy 7.4 and looking at the phrase, non-compliant in dimensions for approved exterior signage, and trying to locate any possible reading of it that didn't mean what I knew it meant. I couldn't. It meant what it meant. They were citing his flag, his American flag, properly mounted, properly displayed, according to the flag code, on our own porch. The letter cited Wren Hollow Estates HOA Policy 7.4, which pertained to exterior decorative elements, and stated that the 30 by 18-inch American flag mounted on a standard bracket on our porch was non-compliant in dimensions for approved exterior signage and subject to a fine if not removed within 14 days. I read it twice myself. Then I set it on the kitchen table and started dinner and thought about what it meant that someone in our cul-de-sac had looked at our porch in the week of Veterans Day and decided that this was the thing worth reporting. Damon read it twice at the kitchen table when he got home, which I could tell because he had the particular stillness he gets when he's deciding how to respond to something rather than just reacting to it. He'd been doing this for 26 years, in every situation from a junior officer dressing down a subordinate to a sergeant major briefing a general, and I knew what it meant. He set the letter down, looked at me, and said, with a quietness that was more precise than anger, "They know what they did." He was right. And what came after that letter, what we did in the following 6 weeks, and what the town of Garrett Falls did along with us, became something that I think neither the woman who filed the complaint nor the board member who processed it had any possible framework for predicting, because it required understanding not just the law, which was entirely on our side from the first morning, but the specific character of a community that had been watching quietly for long enough that they were ready to stop watching and start moving. My husband Damon read it twice at the kitchen table, which I could tell because he had the particular stillness he gets when he's deciding how to respond to something rather than just reacting to it. He'd been doing this for 26 years, in every situation from a junior officer dressing down a subordinate to a sergeant major briefing a general, and I knew what it meant. He set the letter down, looked at me, and said, with a quietness that was more precise than anger, "They know what they did." He was right. And what came after that letter, what we did in the following 6 weeks, and what the town of Garrett Falls did along with us, became something that I think neither the woman who filed the complaint nor the board member who processed it had any possible framework for predicting, because it required understanding not just the law, which was entirely on our side from the first morning, but the specific character of a community that had been watching quietly for long enough that they were ready to stop watching and start moving. My name is Renata Welch. I've been married to Sergeant Major Damon Welch for 23 years, which means I've been moving across the country every 2 to 3 years, raising our kids in whatever on-post or off-post community the Army put us near, building friendships that had to be deep fast because they never lasted long geographically, and learning that the specific feeling of finally settling into a permanent home is one of the most meaningful experiences I've ever had. Damon joined the Army at 19, served 22 years as an infantryman and later as a Ranger-qualified senior NCO, deployed 4 times across 2 different theaters, and retired as a sergeant major with the kind of record that earns a formal ceremony and a folded flag and a room full of junior soldiers who snap to attention because they genuinely want to and not because they've been told to. He is, to put it plainly, not a complicated person. He is a deeply principled person, which is different and harder, and the flag on our porch is the expression of one of those principles in the most straightforward possible form. Wren Hollow Estates was the first house we chose entirely freely, not because of proximity to a base, not because it was available in our moving window, but because we wanted it. The porch was one of the reasons. It faced east and caught the morning light in a way that made Damon say, when we were walking through it with the realtor, that he could sit on that porch every morning for the rest of his life. The bracket for the flag went up the second week, and the flag itself went up the week after that. And every morning since then, Damon has had coffee on that porch with the flag next to him, which is not a statement or a performance or a political gesture. It is a man sitting on his own porch, next to the thing that represents everything he spent 22 years of his life for, which he has earned the right to do in the most literal sense available in this country. The flag is a specific flag, and that matters to this story. It's not a fresh flag bought from a big box store. It's a 30 by 18-inch nylon American flag that has flown at 7 different homes across 3 decades of Army life, that was present at 2 deployments, that was folded and unfolded and refolded more times than either of us can count, and that Damon has maintained with the specific care that military families have for the physical objects that represent what they've given. The bracket holds it at the correct angle. The flag is never flown in poor weather. It is never left up after dark without illumination. Damon treats it according to the United States Flag Code because that is who he is and because it is the right thing to do. The woman who filed the complaint against it was our neighbor across the cul-de-sac, a woman named Margaret Foss, who had moved into Wren Hollow Estates 14 months before we did, and who had, in those 14 months, established herself as someone who had opinions about the community's visual presentation that she pursued through the HOA's complaint system with a frequency that our property manager, a patient woman named Elaine Cho, had once described to me. With admirable professional restraint, as active engagement, Margaret had complained about a neighbor's mailbox color, requesting it be changed to a more neutral shade that she felt better aligned with the community's architectural palette. She had filed a complaint about the specific shade of another neighbor's shutters, citing the HOA's exterior paint policy in a way that required Elaine to pull the original approval records to confirm the shade had been pre-approved. She had filed a complaint about the seasonal wreath on a door 2 houses down from hers, arguing that its dimensions exceeded what she characterized as appropriate for the size of the door frame, a measurement she had apparently made herself and provided in the complaint with more precision than most people bring to actual construction projects. And she had filed the flamingo complaint, which Elaine had told me about with the particular expression of someone narrating an event they hadn't been sure was real while it was happening. We knew about Margaret before the letter arrived, which is to say we'd learned from the informal intelligence network that exists in every residential community that she was the person most likely to file a complaint about anything that struck her as off-standard. What we hadn't anticipated, what neither Damon nor I had given enough weight to, was that she would look at an American flag on a veteran's porch and see it as a dimensional violation. Not because we expected her to be reverent about it out of some principled position, but because we thought, perhaps naively, that even someone with Margaret Foss's complaint filing history would recognize that this was a different category of action, that it would require her to read a calendar and make a considered decision and proceed anyway. She did proceed anyway, and Damon's response when he read the letter, sitting quietly at the kitchen table and then setting it down with that specific controlled stillness, was the same response he'd spent 22 years developing for situations where the right answer was to be measured first and decisive after. The morning after the letter arrived, Damon called our county's Veterans Services office, which was the first call, and it was the right first call because the woman who answered, a retired Army warrant officer named Specialist Hannah Reeves, who now ran the county Veterans Affairs desk, had the specific mix of warmth and competence that comes from people who have served and then dedicated their civilian careers to serving the people who served alongside them. Damon described the situation. She said, without a moment's hesitation, they can't legally do that. The Freedom to Display the American Flag Act of 2005 prohibits any HOA from preventing a homeowner from displaying the American flag on their own property. That's federal law. have them send any further correspondence to this office. She also gave him the name of an attorney who specialized in veterans' rights and flag display cases. A man named Philip Stram who had, she told Damon, handled 3 similar situations in our state in the past 2 years and had a very clean record on them. Philip Stram picked up the phone that same morning, and within 40 minutes of his first conversation with Damon, he'd confirmed the legal picture with a completeness that was almost elegant in how definitive it was. The Freedom to Display the American Flag Act of 2005 is a federal statute that specifically preempts any HOA rule, deed restriction, or condominium bylaw that would prevent a member from displaying the American flag on their property. Congress passed it unanimously in 2005, specifically because HOA flag disputes had been recurring across the country, and the language of the act is unambiguous. It prohibits any provision of a governing document from restricting or preventing a homeowner from displaying the flag. The Act allows HOAs to establish reasonable regulations about the time, place, and manner of display, but explicitly states that these regulations cannot amount to a prohibition, and courts have consistently held that dimensional restrictions, which effectively prohibit display by specifying a size too small to constitute a meaningful flag presentation, cross the line from regulation into prohibition. A 30 by 18-inch flag on a standard porch bracket is not an oversized installation. It is, in fact, a modestly sized residential flag. The dimensional citation in the complaint had no relationship to any time, place, or manner regulation that would survive scrutiny under the 2005 Act. The complaint, Philip told Damon, was not merely wrong, it was federally preempted. We should respond formally, Philip said, and the response should be swift, clear, and completely specific about the legal framework. I want them to understand before they do anything else that they've made a mistake that exposes them to federal liability, and I want that understanding documented in writing. The flag stays up. Nothing about the flag changes. We respond and we wait. The flag stayed up. Philip's letter went out 3 days later, certified mail, addressed to the board president, the property manager, and the association's registered legal counsel. It cited the 2005 Act by statute number, explained why the dimensional complaint did not constitute a permissible time, place, and manner restriction under the Act, noted that any attempt to levy or collect a fine for flag display would constitute a violation of federal law and would be vigorously contested, and requested written confirmation within 10 days that the complaint had been closed and removed from our property record. I want to describe what happened in the community in those 10 days, because the legal piece, as clear as it was only part of what this became. Word got around, because word always gets around in a small residential community, and because Damon had told 2 neighbors about the letter, not out of a desire to broadcast it, but because they'd seen him standing in the front yard reading it that morning and had come over to ask if everything was okay. Those 2 neighbors told their neighbors, and within about 72 hours of the letter's arrival, Elaine Cho had received what she later told me was an unusual volume of calls and messages from Wren Hollow residents asking about the complaint and expressing varying degrees of concern, disbelief, and in several cases, something closer to outrage. The neighbor who called me specifically, who I want to tell you about because he matters to this story, was a man named Curtis Webb, who lived 3 houses down from us, a retired firefighter in his mid-60s who had lived in Wren Hollow Estates for 8 years and who had a son who'd served 2 tours in the Marine Corps. Curtis knocked on my door on a Thursday evening, 3 days after Philip's letter had gone out, with the demeanor of a man who has thought carefully about something and decided it is worth saying out loud. He asked me, politely and without presumption, whether he and Damon would be able to talk. I brought him in. The conversation lasted about 45 minutes. What Curtis proposed, sitting at our kitchen table, was not confrontational in any way that would embarrass the community or create the wrong kind of attention. What he proposed was simply that if Damon's flag was going to be a complaint, then the neighborhood ought to know what flags looked like on the houses of people who chose to fly them, because he'd be flying his son's Marine Corps flag and his own family's American flag the following morning, and he suspected he wouldn't be the only one if the right people heard what was happening. "I'm not trying to start something," Curtis said. "I just think Margaret Foss should understand what she did." Damon looked at Curtis for a moment, and then he nodded once, the particular nod of a man who has spent decades distinguishing between things worth doing and things that only feel worth doing in the moment. "I appreciate that," he said. "I think that's exactly right." Curtis made 4 phone calls that evening. Those 4 people made calls of their own. By the following Monday, 10 days after the original complaint letter arrived, the count of American flags newly displayed on homes in Wren Hollow Estates was not 2. It was 12. 12 flags on 12 houses across our cul-de-sac and the 2 adjacent streets, hung properly and with care, not as a demonstration of anything aggressive or theatrical, but as a statement made in the language of the flag itself, by people who had quietly decided that this was the moment to make it. Curtis's 2 flags, one American and one Marine Corps, mounted side by side on his front porch. The flag on the Hendersons' house, hung by a couple in their mid-70s, which was the detail I couldn't get past when their neighbor Rosa told me about it. Jim Henderson had served in Vietnam. He hadn't talked about it in decades. He and Alina had a flag somewhere in the house, had always had one, but had never displayed it, because Jim had never quite been able to explain what displaying it would mean after what he'd seen, and so it had stayed folded. When Rosa told Jim what had happened with Damon's flag, Jim went into the bedroom closet and found his flag and brought it to Alina and asked her to help him put it up. That detail I cried about, alone at my kitchen table, the morning Rosa told me, which I mention not because I want to tell you about my emotional state, but because I think it tells you something true about what happens when a community finds an occasion to be itself. The flag on the Parker house, a family with 2 school-age kids and no military connection at all, hung by a man named Ben Parker who told his wife when he came home from the hardware store with the bracket, "I'm not going to be the house that doesn't have one." The flag on old Mr. Aguilar's door, a Korean War-era veteran in his mid-80s who lived alone 3 houses down and who Curtis had apparently simply knocked on the door for, and whom Damon drove to the hardware store personally to help pick out a proper bracket, because Mr. Aguilar's hands shook too much to drive himself, and this was something he wanted to do. And 8 more. Margaret Foss could see 4 of the 12 flags from her front window. I know this because 2 different neighbors told me they'd seen her standing at that window on different mornings that week, and that on neither morning did she come outside. The HOA board met in an emergency session that week, which Elaine confirmed to me was not a meeting she'd enjoyed facilitating. Philip's letter was on the table. The complaint was on the table. The 12 flags were visible from the street outside the clubhouse, which was in Wren Hollow Estates itself and whose parking lot was flanked by 2 of the newly flagged houses. The board voted unanimously to withdraw the complaint, strike it from our property record, and issue a written acknowledgement that the flag was in compliance with applicable federal law. The vote was 4-0 because the 5th board member, the one who had processed the original complaint, resigned before the vote was called. Philip called me with the vote outcome, and I called Damon into the kitchen to tell him. He heard it, nodded. "Good," he said, in the same quiet, precise voice he'd used the morning after the letter arrived. Then he went back out to the porch and sat in his chair in the morning light, and I watched him through the kitchen window, and the flag was right there next to him where it had always been and always would be. But that's not quite where the story ends, because something else happened, something that neither Damon nor I had anticipated, and that turned out to be the part of this story I think about most when I think about what it means to live in a community that's actually a community. The town noticed. Garrett Falls is not a large town, about 14,000 people, the kind of place where the local newspaper is still an actual paper, still delivered on Thursdays, still read by people who live there and care about what it covers. The Garrett Falls Courier ran a front-page story 3 days after the HOA board's vote, and I want to tell you how that story happened because it didn't happen because anyone called the paper. The reporter, a woman named Diane Kessler, who'd been covering Garrett Falls for 11 years, lived 2 subdivisions over from Wren Hollow and had driven past the street on her way to something else, and had noticed, before any of this became a story, that a cluster of residential properties had suddenly put up a lot of flags in the same week. She'd asked a neighbor about it, gotten the broad strokes, and done her reporting from there. The story ran under the headline, "Neighbors Rally Around Veterans Flag in Wren Hollow," and included a photograph of our porch that Diane had taken with Damon's permission on the morning she came to talk to him. The flag clearly visible and correctly mounted, Damon in the foreground in a flannel shirt with the relaxed gravity that he carries naturally, and that photographs as exactly what it is. The story included a photo of Curtis Webb's front walk with both his flags. It included Philip Stram's explanation of the 2005 Act in terms accessible enough that I've quoted it to people since. And in the third paragraph, without any direction from us, it included the date of the original complaint letter, 3 days after Veterans Day. Diane Kessler had noticed the date herself. She'd included it without commentary, which was the right editorial choice because the fact did not require commentary. It only required statting. The story ran on a Thursday. By Friday afternoon, Elaine Cho had received 11 sets of flowers, not from residents of Wren Hollow, but from people in Garrett Falls who had read the Courier and had felt moved to tell someone at the property management company that they were glad this had gone the way it had. Elaine told me about this in a phone call and said she'd never received flowers from strangers in 16 years of property management, and that she wasn't entirely sure what to do with them, which I found genuinely funny. The Garrett Falls American Legion Post issued a formal statement of support for Damon that they published in their newsletter and posted in their window, which is on the main street downtown, and which several people mentioned seeing to me over the following weeks. The high school ROTC program sent a card, signed by 34 students, that Damon received on a Tuesday and sat with for a long time before putting it in the same desk drawer as the town council letter. The town council's formal letter of commendation arrived the following Monday, signed by all 5 members, and included language about community values and civic respect for military service that was clearly written with more care than most official correspondence manages, which I think speaks to who had drafted it. Damon accepted it with exactly the grace that 22 years of service had built into him, sincerely and without making it about himself. He framed it and hung it in his office, next to his discharge papers and the folded flag from his retirement ceremony and a photo of his platoon from the first deployment, the one where 4 of the men in that photo didn't all come home the same way they went. The story had one more development that I want to tell you about, because it is the piece I've thought about most in the months since, and it doesn't involve the HOA or the law or the town council at all. About 3 weeks after the Courier story ran, Damon was sitting on the porch on a Saturday morning when Jim Henderson came walking down the cul-de-sac toward our house. Jim is a quiet man in his mid-70s who walks slowly and doesn't come visiting without a reason. He had a small wrapped parcel under his arm. He came up the porch steps, set the parcel on the table next to Damon's coffee, and said, "I want you to have this." Inside was a small framed photograph, not a reproduction but an original print of a unit in the field, Vietnam-era, men in jungle utilities with the exhausted alertness that combat photographs have. Jim pointed to a figure on the left. "That's me," he said, 19 years old. He looked at the flag on the bracket. "I should have put mine up a long time ago," he said. "I'm glad you gave me a reason." Damon shook his hand. Jim went back down the porch steps and walked home down the cul-de-sac, and the flags on both their houses were visible at the same time, and I watched it from the kitchen window and thought about what the original complaint letter had actually accomplished, which was not what Margaret Foss had intended it to accomplish at all. The 12 flags are still up, all of them. When we left off, Philip Stram's legal letter had gone to the HOA board. 12 flags had gone up across Wren Hollow estates in the space of 1 week, and the board had called an emergency meeting. This is the part of the story where the legal resolution happened, and then the part after that, which is what I actually think about most. The emergency board meeting took place on a Monday evening, 12 days after the original complaint letter had arrived at our house. Elaine Cho described it to me afterward with the measured care of a professional who understood what she was and wasn't supposed to share, but who also felt, I think, that I deserved to know the shape of what had happened. 4 board members were present. The 5th, the one who had processed Margaret's complaint, arrived, handed Elaine a written resignation, and left the meeting room before it was formally called to order. Philip Stram's letter was on the table. A copy of the Freedom to Display the American Flag Act of 2005 was on the table, provided by the HOA's own legal counsel, with a cover note that Elaine described as brief and extremely clear. Also on the table was a printed record of the complaint filing and the specific details of how it had been processed, which told a story that the 4 remaining board members apparently found uncomfortable. The board member who'd resigned hadn't simply received Margaret's complaint and forwarded it mechanically. He'd agreed with it, expedited its processing, and bypassed the standard legal review period that existed in the HOA's own complaint procedures for exactly the purpose of catching issues like this one before they became letters. A 5-minute check against the federal statute would have stopped the whole thing before it left the office. The check hadn't happened. The vote was unanimous and took about 4 minutes. The complaint was withdrawn. A written acknowledgement that Damon's flag was in full compliance with applicable federal law was drafted, signed, and sent to Philip's office within 48 hours. Philip called us the morning he received it and read the key language over the phone in the formal, pleased way of an attorney reading something that says exactly what it's supposed to say. Damon said good and went out to the porch. The question of whether we would pursue any further action against the board or the association for the complaint itself was one Philip raised with us directly, and I want to tell you how Damon answered it because I think it tells you more about him than most things in this story do. Philip explained that there were potential avenues. A formal complaint to the state's HOA regulatory office, a civil claim for the stress and disruption the complaint had caused, potentially a request for attorney's fees given the clear federal preemption. Damon listened to all of it and then said, "The complaint is gone, the flag is up. What I want is for it to stay that way." Philip said he could file for an injunction against any future flag-related action if Damon wanted a formal guarantee. Damon said, "If they come back for the flag, we'll deal with it then. Right now, I'd rather be done." Philip noted for the record that we were reserving all rights and declined to pursue further action at this time. The case was closed. Margaret Foss did not file any more complaints in the 3 months after the board meeting, which was unusual enough that Elaine noticed it and mentioned it to me during a routine call about something unrelated. Whether this was because she understood what she'd done or because she was simply strategic enough to understand that the political landscape of Wren Hollow Estates had shifted in ways that made further complaints risky, I couldn't say. She remained in her house across the cul-de-sac. She did not fly a flag. The Courier story, when it ran, did something none of us had fully anticipated. Diane Kessler's reporting was clean and specific, the facts laid out without editorializing, the legal framework explained clearly, the timeline including the Veterans Day detail stated without commentary because the date didn't need any help to land. But because the paper was a real local paper with real readership in a town of 14,000 people, the story reached people in a way that a neighborhood dispute usually doesn't, and what it reached was something that had apparently been looking for an occasion. By the Friday after the story ran, Damon had received letters, not calls or informal texts or comments on the Courier's website, but actual handwritten letters mailed to our address from people in Garrett Falls who had read the paper and wanted to say something in writing and meant it enough to put it in an envelope. 12 letters that first week, more the following week, until the count reached 31 over the course of about 3 weeks. Several were from veterans. Several were from families of veterans. Several were from people with no military connection at all who simply wanted to say that they'd seen the story and that it had mattered to them in a way they wanted him to know about. One was from a woman in her 80s whose father had come home from Korea and never talked about it, who wrote, in a handwriting that was clearly her careful best, that she was glad the flag had stayed up. That one Damon read twice. He read all of them at the kitchen table on the Sunday after the first batch arrived, which took about 40 minutes, and he was quiet for a long time after he'd stacked them back in order. I asked him what he was thinking. He said, I didn't think about any of this when I put the flag up. I just put it up because that's what we do. It's always been what we do." He looked out at the porch where the flag was visible through the window and then back at the stack of letters. "I'm glad it's up," he said. "I'm glad all of it happened the way it did." I told him I was glad too, and that was true, even though some part of me still felt the anger of the original letter and probably always would. Because a thing having come out right doesn't erase the fact that someone looked at that flag and made the choice they made. But Damon had the perspective that 22 years of service builds, which is the perspective that what matters most is not the people who create the problem, but the people who show up in response to it. And the response in this case had been, by any measure, more than we'd expected from any of it. The town council's letter of commendation arrived the following Monday, 5 members' signatures across the bottom in the formal typeset that official correspondence uses, and the language of it was better than most official letters manage, specific about service and specific about the flag, and not trying to say more than it actually could say, which is the mark of someone who'd thought carefully about what words they had the standing to use. Damon framed it and put it in his office beside his discharge papers and the retirement ceremony flag and the photo of his platoon from the first deployment. And now, the photograph Jim Henderson had given him of a 19-year-old in the field in Vietnam. Philip filed a brief advisory letter with the HOA's legal counsel 2 weeks after the complaint was closed, not threatening and not demanding, simply noting that he was available should any future questions arise about flag display regulations in the community, and that he trusted the board's understanding of the applicable federal law was now thorough and would remain so. The HOA's counsel acknowledged receipt. No further flag complaints were filed in the following year. "I want to tell you where the 12 flags are now, because it matters." Curtis Webb's 2 flags are still up on his front porch, the American flag and the Marine Corps flag, positioned exactly as he hung them the morning after our kitchen conversation. He told me in January, when I saw him getting his mail on a cold morning, that he'd been meaning to put them up for years, and that it had taken this situation to finally do it, which made him simultaneously grateful and embarrassed that it had taken this long. I told him the flags were one of the best things about walking out our front door in the morning. He looked at them for a second and said he thought so too. The Henderson's flag is still up. Jim Henderson told Damon, in the weeks after everything had settled, that he'd been keeping his flag inside for decades, because there was a part of him that felt like flying it would be claiming something he wasn't sure he deserved to claim, given what he knew and what he'd seen and what the war had been. The conversation took place on our porch on a Saturday morning, the 2 of them sitting in the 2 chairs Damon had set out with coffee, and they talked for almost 2 hours, which was longer than I'd ever seen Jim Henderson spend talking to anyone about anything. Damon told him, in the direct way he has, that Jim had earned every right to fly that flag that any living man had earned, and that the flag wasn't a statement about the war. It was a statement about the person who served. Jim went home and came back the following Saturday with a small framed photograph, the same one he'd shown Elena, of a 19-year-old in the field in Vietnam. He set it on the porch table while Damon and I were both there and said, "I want you to have this. I want you to know there are more of us than you might think." Damon thanked him in a way that I could see meant more than the words themselves, and Jim went home, and both their flags were visible from our front walk at the same time, and I stood there looking at them for a while. Ben Parker's flag is still there. So is Mr. Aguilar's, which his son-in-law helped mount because Mr. Aguilar's hands shook too much and he'd wanted it to be level. So are the other 9. Some of them have added small additional flags beside the American flag. A Marine Corps eagle, globe, and anchor on one, a Navy anchor on another, an Army star on a third, and on the house of a woman named Dolores Reyes, whom I'd lived near for over a year without knowing her full story, a gold star banner, which is the flag flown by families who have lost a son or daughter in military service. I learned what it meant from Yolanda the morning I saw it go up, and I walked to Dolores's door that afternoon and knocked and told her I was glad she was our neighbor, which is one of the most inadequate things I've ever said, and which Dolores received with a grace I didn't deserve given how inadequate it was. The morning I come back to most, when I think about this story and what it came to mean, is a morning in late December. It was cold and utterly clear, one of those winter mornings where the air is so still that nothing moves, and all the flags on all those houses were hanging straight down, not waving, not catching wind, just there in the pale early light. Damon was on the porch with his coffee, and I was watching from the kitchen. And from where I stood, I could see 3 of the 12 flags at once. Ours, and the Hendersons, and Curtis's. And the light was just beginning to come over the roof lines the way it does in December, low and golden, and with that winter quality that makes familiar things look considered. Margaret Foss had wanted one flag to disappear. What she had gotten instead was 12 flags and a front page and 31 letters to a man she'd tried to cite into compliance. And Jim Henderson, finding his way to something he'd been keeping in a closet for half a century, and Mr. Aguilar's hands in his coat pockets while his son-in-law leveled the bracket, and Ben Parker explaining to his kids over breakfast why they'd put one up, and Dolores Reyes's gold star banner visible from the street for the first time in the years since she'd moved in. She got all of that instead of the quiet neighborhood streetscape she'd apparently been trying to maintain. She got a street that looked like itself, finally, which I think is the most accurate way to say what those 12 flags actually were. Thumbnail text, 10 words. She reported his flag. The whole town raised 12 mori.